Thanks for showing up to Veggie Happenings in March. We're super excited to have you here. We'll wait just a few minutes and make sure that we've got everybody connected in. Everybody's super excited about planting their spring garden. We're not quite to the spring garden yet, but almost. And we have some really exciting topics today, where we had a topic on cover crops. Kathy McFan, our resident expert on cover crops, had talked to us in the fall about planting cover crops to increase the richness of your soil. And now, what do you do with the cover crops now when you want to get started on your spring garden? Judith Turner is going to be talking to us about potatoes. They're something that we're ready to plant potatoes. And Jennifer Dornbush is going to be talking to us about irrigation, because especially in this year when we're not getting the water that we need so far, we're keeping our fingers crossed, but we're going to need to be really careful on our water, as we usually try to be, but she's going to give us some good tips on that. So, and I wanted to say before we started, I bet everybody is super excited about tomatoes. It was inadvertently corrected and said that we were talking about tomatoes. That's next month. And so, but remember, we did start tomato seeds in February, and we had a nice intro on that. Here's my tomato plants that I've just potted. And my worry is that they're already a little big. So I won't be putting mine in until, and I've got a whole bunch. I won't be putting mine in until at least April 15th, and maybe, toward the end of April. So I just wanted to remind everybody that your audio and video will be off for this webinar, because it is a webinar. And please use the Q&A box for questions. And we are recording this, so it will be available. You may want to take a picture of this if you have a QR reader. I will put this up at the end of the show as well, just so that you will be able to access our information easily. So sustainable gardening. We have, okay, so as master gardeners, we nurture and protect the soil. We plant the right plant in the right place at the right time. I don't like to babysit tomatoes, so I'm not planting them until after April 15th for my area. We use compost and organic amendments. We use flowers that benefit plants and beneficial insects. We really try to do minimum soil disturbance, so we're not digging the soil up. We try not to use synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, or pesticides. We're growing our food for a reason, and we really want our food to be natural and organic, and so we don't need to use those things. We mulch to save water and to prevent weeds. Okay, so now we're gonna go through, and Kathy McFan is going to talk to you about what to do with your cover crops.
I talked to you in fall about the option of planting a cover crop. And basically we promote, as master gardeners, the perspective of no naked soils. We don't like naked soils, and plants don't like naked soils. So we either try to keep our vegetables in the garden and producing throughout the year, and there are options for doing that throughout the year in Sonoma County, or mulching or composting, or the option of cover cropping. So we take a lot of nutrients out of the soil when we vegetable garden, and we need to return nutrients, carbon, minerals to continue to grow our garden. And we have choices about how to do that. And if you've taken any master gardener programs, you know about compost, and we certainly promote that. But we're gonna focus again on the other option for home gardeners of cover cropping. So a cover crop is basically a non-food crop that you plant when the garden might be fallow, with the intention of enhancing the soil. And cover crops can be used in a lot of different ways. I'm going to be focusing on very specifically just improving the structure and the health of your soil. So just as a reminder, we see the garden and we see the top of the garden. That's what we usually look at. But if you look beneath the soil, there's a whole lot going on when there are plants in the soil. So the roots are as large a part of the plant as the part we see. This is obvious, but I'm just pointing it out again. So in the roots, there's the area around the roots, which is called the rhizosphere. And as we've been able to examine what happens around the roots with a more detailed microscopic perspective, they've found that there's a great deal of activity. There's a great deal of interaction between the live elements in the soil, the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil, and the bacteria, the positive bacteria in the soil. And there's a symbiotic, synergistic relationship between the roots in the rhizosphere and the mycorrhizal and the bacteria. Basically, the plants feed those elements of the soil. They will feed up to 30% of their sugars into the soil. And they don't do that for free. They're smart. They get something back. So the mycorrhizal network extends the roots. They actually interpenetrate into the roots, and they help the roots of the plant absorb and gain access to nutrients. This is a comparison of sort of the root zone, the active root zone between a corn plant without mycorrhizal and one with a very active fungal network. This is taken from Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education, which is a very, very exciting site if you like cover crops and soil science. So, check it out. This is a cover crop. There are lots of different cover crops. This was an experiment we did at Bear Farms in Santa Rosa. This is barley. So when you're planting a cover crop for your garden bed, there are few main kinds of crops that you want to plant. One are the grasses, barley, oats, winter wheat. This is an example of a grass that has a high amount of carbon and plant material. This is, if you've used cover crops at all, you're probably familiar with this. This is fava beans. And fava beans and other legumes are kind of a miracle plant because they produce these small bacterial nodules. The bacteria in the roots of the legumes and a few other kinds of plants in the plant kingdom actually take nitrogen from the air and deposit into these nodules, which I think is very exciting. Not everyone does, but it's very exciting.
Kathy?
So, yes.
Kathy, some people are saying they can't hear you very well.
Okay, I will speak up. I've been having a little trouble with my microphone, so I will speak up. So let me go back just to say that these are the mycorrhizal or the bacterial nodules on the cover crop, the legume cover crop. And if you pull it up, when it's 10 to 30% flowering, you'll see these wonderful nodules that are nitrogen, pure nitrogen being added to your soil. So cover crops, just as a reminder, we planted them late September through October. Sometimes you can get into early November. And it's a mix of legumes, the nitrogen fixing legumes, deeper rooted grasses, and other kinds of plants can be added in. And the advantage of using a mix is you get a wider variety of beneficial mycorrhizal fungi and bacteria. Plus you get, as the plant breaks down, your legumes are going to break down more quickly and your grasses are going to break down more slowly. So using these over the years, you have a kind of more continuous stream of nutrients for the plant. So some options for harvesting your cover crop. You get this beautiful production of plant material. And you'll see in most directions, when people talk about using cover crops, historically, they've talked about chopping them down and digging them into the soil. But as master gardeners, we suggest that you try not to disturb the soil. More and more, we found that the structure of the soil is complex, and that it holds the carbon. And if you can not dig in that soil, that you release less carbon. Another, you can chop down the material and put it into the compost. But a simpler process that we're recommending is either chop, drop, and compost, or chop, drop, and sheet mulch. And I'll talk about why you would use those different strategies. So if you remember in the fall, I had impulsively bought some of these stock tanks because I had extra plants and I needed someplace else to plant them. But I bought planting mix and put it in there. And I wasn't in love with the planting mix. It didn't produce as well as some of my other soil. So I planted cover crops. And this was sort of mid-season. This was what, November, December. They looked like this. Okay. A month ago, they looked like this. And they were the legumes, the fava beans. You see fava beans, you see vetch, there's something called Dundee peas and barley and some oats all in there. So it was time to take them down. So these are easy to take down, and you want them flowering. The flowers are like that, and it's always hard to take down your cover crops because the flowers are so attractive. But basically, you just take garden shears and you chop it up. You can see one of these tanks has the material chopped and the other's ready for chopping, just like that. The smaller the pieces that you chop the plant, the more quickly it will decompose. So smaller pieces, more quickly decomposing. So here, mostly chopped. And in order to speed up the process of the decomposition of the plant, I layer a nice layer of compost on top of it. So essentially you're composting in place, if you think about it. You've got green materials and some slightly more high carbon materials of the grasses, and you're creating compost. But the advantage of the cover crops, remember that rhizosphere? You've left those roots in the soil. So there's still, you've improved the structure of the soil. You've created, as the roots decompose, there are deeper channels that absorb the water. You keep alive soil in a different way than if you just layer on compost and mulch. So some thoughts about what you want to consider when you're using a cover crop is you want to consider how long before you're going to plant your next crop. So as you can see, when you chop up that material and you put the compost on, for a little while it's raw. So that might not be the optimal bed for starting your carrots, right? Because they get lost right in there and they take a finer soil. And they might not be the best place to start your little lettuces because they won't have totally decomposed. However, it usually takes 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the kind of a cover crop you have, for it to decompose. The legumes decompose more quickly. Grasses take a longer time, generally 4 to 8 weeks. So usually I use cover crops in those beds where I'm going to be putting out starts and later spring, early summer starts. So ideally things like tomatoes, peppers, squash, cucumbers, where you can actually kind of pull the rough material that's on the top away and stick in your start. So consider what you want to plant. And here's a tomato. One of the years, I did the cover crop. I put in the mulch, and then I covered it all with some straw, and it was very, very happy there. So, and then, we have the promise that we're all looking forward to of the summer produce. So that's pretty much harvesting your cover crops. I'm going to stop sharing, and if you have any questions, we'll get to those later.
Okay, so Judith is going to be talking about growing potatoes. And one thing I wanted to tell you ahead of time, I'm just going to grab in on her time, is we have another group. A lot of you are starting to try to make sure you use everything in your garden. So, and it's called Master Food Preservers. We've just started in Sonoma County, but I want to show you what I did with my 44 pounds of potatoes last year, as we couldn't eat them all at once. I took them and dehydrated them, sliced them up and dehydrated. So if you're thinking of doing potatoes, you might be able to plant an extra row just so you'll keep yourself going through the winter. So here's Judith to tell you all about potatoes.
Well, hello. Spring is just about here, and it's the perfect time to start planting potatoes. When most people think about potatoes, they think about this one, the Burbank russet potato, the most common potato in everyone's pantry. This potato was actually developed by our own Luther Burbank when he was still in Massachusetts. And it was such a commercial success that it enabled him to move his operation to Santa Rosa, where he lived the rest of his life, breeding and developing new species of fruits, vegetables, and flowers that are still very popular today. This is the potato, this Burbank russet that made Idaho famous, and also the one that McDonald's most often uses in their French fries. But potatoes come in lots of different shapes and sizes. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah. So potatoes come in many, many shapes, sizes, colors, and textures. And in this picture, we see the all blue, which literally is all blue, makes fantastic blue mashed potatoes if you want to scare people. At the very top of the picture, you'll see the Yukon Gold, which is a marvelous all-purpose potato. And also this oddly named French finger potato, which is highly prized by French chefs for its nutty flavor. There's other kinds as well, many kinds and many other uses. Next slide, please. So you don't plant potatoes by seeds. You plant them with seed potatoes. Seed potatoes are organic, disease-resistant potatoes that you buy in a farm supply or nursery, not in the grocery store. The grocery store ones are treated for sprout suppression, so they won't help you much. But from each one of these little indentations grows a sprout. And you can see them starting on the little picture on the right there. You want to take each of your seed potatoes and cut them so that each little piece has at least one eye. And next slide, please. Okay. And dry them for 1 to 3 days. I just put mine on a tray here. And when they're nice and dry on the cut surface, and they may look a little brown or green, that's fine. They're ready to put in the ground. Next slide, please. This is how potatoes grow. From the seed potato, first come the sprouts or stems, which come above the ground and start producing leaves, which is the power center of the plant. It produces food and energy to grow the potatoes under the ground. Under the ground, you have stolons, which are little projections from the seed potato, and at the end of each one will grow a new potato. Next slide, please. Potatoes love deep, rich, moist soil full of organic material. To be successful, you'll want to mix about 50% of your native soil with compost, which also aids in drainage and keeps it nice and loose. Make a trench about 8 inches deep and your rows 30 to 36 inches apart, and put your seed pieces in the ground, in the trench, a full 12 inches apart. This picture makes them look closer together, but believe me, if you go closer, you'll get fewer potatoes. Then cover those up with about 3 to 4 inches of soil and let them be. Your soil is moist, and don't add any more water until you see the leaves coming out. then you can start to water them. Next slide, please. When the plants are anywhere from 8 to 12 inches high, you can strip off some of the lower leaves and start hilling up the side dirt up against the stems. If you've planted tomatoes, you know that when you plant a seedling tomato, you strip off the lower leaves and plant it right up to its neck, because roots will form from every place where there was a leaf. But with potatoes, it's stolons, and stolons produce potatoes. So the higher you go, the more stolons you'll get. You may run out of dirt, so you can also use compost, straw, or leaves, anything that keeps the soil covered, and just keep going up and up until the plant reaches its full maturity. At the point that the leaves come out, you'll want to maintain even soil moisture and not let it dry out. Next slide, please. When the flowers appear, you'll know that your harvest is very close. They're very pretty, but they quickly die and the plant turns brown. And at that point, you can harvest your potatoes. You want to take a spading fork or a shovel and gently put it in the ground, maybe a foot or so away from the plant, because the potatoes are spread out at quite a distance, and gently pry up. If the, next slide, please. If the soil is very loose, you can tug on the whole plant and it may come up all intact. And you'll see lots of different sizes of potatoes, some for different uses. Next slide. You do want to avoid sun exposure on your potatoes. As they grow, they often push up out of the ground. And so that's another reason why you need to really keep that soil surface covered with soil, leaves, compost, or straw. Greening is not good for you. You shouldn't eat green potatoes because they contain a toxin called solanine. It would take an awful lot of green potatoes to make you truly sick, but these potatoes are best discarded. Next slide, please. Questions often arise as to whether we can grow yams or sweet potatoes the same way. And for a variety of reasons, it's not that easy here in Sonoma County. For one thing, they require very warm soil, 70 degrees, and I don't think we get there until midsummer. So you have to start them indoors. They need up to 240 days of a frost-free growing period. And once they're in the ground, they spread all over the place. They're really vines, and they just creep all over the ground and take up a lot of space. It's hard to get seed potatoes from out of state because of the California quarantine that's attempting to control the sweet potato weevil. So for all those reasons, it's not really recommended as a sure bet in Sonoma County. Next slide, please. Here are some of the common pests that may afflict your potatoes. Next month, in April, these flea beetles will start arriving. They're iridescent black and small. You'll see little holes in your leaves. Look for them. Aphids are often found on the underside of leaves, and they kind of scrape and leave kind of thin areas on your leaves, and the leaf may look very wilted and weak, sometimes yellowish. And next slide, please. The Colorado potato beetle. So beetles can be excluded from even getting on your plant by putting on a light row cover, which is a woven fabric that is very thin and porous. It lets water and sun in, but it can exclude the insects like beetles because they're big. Make sure it's anchored well on the sides and that you've left plenty of room for the plant to grow, because it's called a floating cover for a reason. As the plant grows, it just pushes this very light fabric up. For the aphids, you can often remove them by a really strong water spray, but insecticidal soap is also very effective against them. Next slide, please. So not everybody has a lot of room in their garden for long rows of potatoes. And potatoes are actually a really good container plant. just avoid overcrowding. If you want a good yield, you really don't want a lot of potato plants in there. These are big plants, but they're grown exactly the same way as you would in the ground, with a couple of caveats. One is that they dry out fast, much faster than in the ground. So you'll have to make sure that you keep them well watered, and that when you do water, it's enough to get to the bottom of the pot. During the very hottest time of the summer, potatoes will stop producing tubers if their soil temperature exceeds 78 degrees. So if it's possible, plant them in an area that may get a little bit of late afternoon shade. Let's see. Depending on the size of your plant, of your pot rather, for instance, it looks like the size of this pot may be able to take 2 seed potatoes. If you have a half cask, maybe 3 or 5, but that's kind of pushing it. So less is more. Now, next slide, please. Last but not least, there's another way of growing potatoes, kind of like a high-rise apartment. The potato tower is formed of all kinds of materials, but most commonly wire, usually lined with soil and straw. And then seed potatoes are put successively in there, and then layered with soil, compost, straw, and another layer of seed potatoes all the way up. You get an awful lot of plants, but probably fewer potatoes per plant, because the potato tubers need leaves to produce the energy and food to make the potatoes. So in towers, you necessarily get fewer leaves, but they're lots of fun, and kids like to do this, and they're very easy to harvest. You just knock over the tower and paw through the dirt and get your potatoes out. So just to wrap up, potatoes are fun, they're easy, they're very rewarding. It's great to show kids how food is grown, and I hope you'll give it a try.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And next, we're going to talk with Jennifer. Jennifer's going to talk to us. And if you remember, Jennifer told us all about citrus. And she, though, is our irrigation expert. And it's really, irrigation is so important. So she's got some great illustrations too. So here's Jennifer.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here to talk about keeping your garden nice and moist. As we all know, to grow vegetables successfully, we need 3 things. We need a good sunny location with full sun, at least 6 hours a day. We need really good enhanced soil, put in plenty of compost so you've got a nice rich soil. And the third thing is to keep your vegetables evenly moist. Next slide, please. And the best way to keep your vegetable garden evenly moist is to use irrigation. So we're going to talk this afternoon about irrigating your vegetable garden, how much, how often. And the big deal is, how do you know how often or how much we have to water? Well, that depends on a number of factors. We need to know what kind of soil you're planting in. If you're planting in a garden that has heavy clay, you know that the clay will hold the water longer. It holds it tight. If you have a garden that has loose, loamy, or sandy soil, the water drains through quickly. But that could all be amended with compost to help even all these things out. It's important to know and top dress your soil, because that will hold the moisture in, and it'll moderate the temperature of your soil and keep it from getting too hot and drying out faster. The amount of water you need in your garden is also very dependent on the temperature. These hot, dry days we have in the middle of the summer, you're going to have a much greater demand for water in your garden than you do this time of year when it's much cooler, and we occasionally get a little bit of rain now and then. And Another key element in how often to water is what kind of vegetables are you growing? Certain vegetables need a lot more water or need it more often than others do. Tomatoes don't need as much water. You can water less often. Little baby microgreens need to be watered all the time because their roots are very, very shallow, and we don't want to let that top 3 or 4 inches dry out. Next slide, please. So the question is when to water. We know that the vegetables will do best if we can keep their roots evenly moist. We don't want them to dry out because that will stunt their growth. It can damage your little feeder roots. And if you keep them too wet and soggy, then you really drown them and you start to get root rot. Most of your vegetables have active root zones that are 6 to 12 inches deep. So it's only important to keep that top 6 to 12 inches evenly moist. The easiest way to tell how moist your soil is to do a quick soil test. I usually do it every day, and I do that simply by sticking my finger about 6 inches into the soil and see if it's really moist. And if I can't get down far enough, I take a little trowel and I dig down a little bit and I test it that way, or pick up a handful of soil and try to make a clump out of it. And if it will stick together in a nice loose ball, then it's nicely moist. But if it falls apart and you can't get it to clump, then it's time to water again. Certain vegetables will tell you their foliage will start to wilt when they dry out. The little microgreens I was talking about, little lettuce plants. Also your cucumbers and your squash in the middle of the summer. In the middle of the afternoon, you'll go out and they'll look very limp because they're just not able to pull up enough moisture to keep them from going limp. What is the best time to water? Well, this is interesting. If you're going to hand water, you're gonna want to do that during the day because a lot of people just use a hose and water their garden that way. And that's not what we recommend, but you can do it. It's a lot often in a community garden, that's all you have available to you is a hose bib and a hose. So do that during the day so that the vegetable plants the leaves have plenty of time to dry out before night comes in the cool weather. And that will avoid fungal diseases developing on those leaves overnight. If you're going to do it with drip irrigation, then you can water any time of day or night that is convenient for you. But I'll just tell you that the water agency really prefers us to water in the middle of the night when the demand on the water system is less. So I set my water timer to go off in the middle of the night during the summer. Next slide, please. To do that, we have to put drip irrigation into I have raised beds. So this illustration is going to be around raised beds. And this is a simple diagram of a 4x8 raised bed that's made out of 2x12 lumber. So you've got 11.5 inches of root space. And if you happen to live in a place where there are a lot of gophers, you're going to want to line the bottom of the raised bed with hardware cloth, or often called gopher wire, to keep those gophers from coming through the bottom. But in this bed, then there are only very simple things you need. You need a good source of water, which is your water source. You're going to attach to that a 1/2 inch irrigation line so that you get plenty of water flowing out. And into that 1/2 inch irrigation line, you can tap in either 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch drip lines. And these drip lines have little emitters every 6 inches or 12 inches. And the inline emitters typically put out a 1/2 gallon of water per hour. So a 1/2 gallon per hour is your dripper, and you can have it 6 inches apart or 12 inches apart. I don't recommend interchanging those in the same bed. In this illustration shows you 3 lines in the bed. You can also, if you're going to grow a lot of smaller vegetables, you can put in 4 lines per bed. And the 1/4 inch drippers are very easy to move around with plastic stakes. Next slide, please. Now that's the simplest. All you have to do is attach the hose, turn it on, leave it on. But there's some other things you might want to consider if you're going to put in a drip irrigation for a long-term project. And here are some of those components to think about. The first one is what we call a pressure regulator, and that is the long, narrow black piece on the far right-hand side. Yeah. And next to it, the pressure regulator steps the house water pressure, which usually comes in at 50 or 60 pounds per square inch, down to 25 pounds per square inch. Drip irrigation systems are designed to run at 25 pounds per square inch to get the right amount of water out in the right amount of time. So the pressure regulator is important to have. Next to it is what we call a backflow preventer. This keeps water from flowing backwards from your irrigation system into the hose bib and then into your house water system. This is something you don't ever want to have happen. So the backflow preventer is a very important thing to have, especially if the vegetable beds you're watering are at a higher elevation than the hose bib that you're attaching to. Or on a hot summer day, as the summer heats up those black plastic tubes, it can push the water backwards, try to get it back into your water system. The third thing to think about is a water filter. Now, if you live in the county and you're on a well, the water filter is critically important to keep your little emitters from getting clogged. If you live in the city, like I do in Santa Rosa, I don't need to put a fancy water filter in. I use the little screen filter that comes on. You can see in the backflow preventer, there's a little screen mesh. That's enough to keep any little small particles from clogging up my emitters. Something not shown, and I often use, is a 1/4 inch piece of tubing that attaches from the 1/2 inch line and runs into the raised bed so that I don't have drippers outside of the soil of the bed. And I'll show you an example of that later on. And the last thing, and I really love these, are programmable irrigation timers. These are battery operated, so you don't have to worry about running electricity out to your hose bib. And the thing that you have to remember with these, they're very easy to program, no problem at all, but you have to remember to change those batteries every year. So every year when we hit daylight savings time, that's when I go out and I replace the batteries so I know that they're going to be good for the next year. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of how I set up my irrigation timer. At the top, you can see a traditional hose bib, just turned it on and off. Now, if you want to use this for a hose as well as the irrigation timer, you can put a little Y connector in there. But for easy viewing, I just left that off. Next, I put in the programmable timer. And then right after that is the backflow preventer that I showed you. And below that is the pressure regulator. And then the next thing is the connector for the 1/2 inch irrigation line. So that's as simple as it is. Next slide, please. Now this one, and I'm apologizing, I really over-engineered this one a little bit, but this is the side of a raised bed, and you can see along the ground, we're going to start at the bottom. Along the ground is the 1/2 inch supply line, and it goes on beyond that to the next raised bed. And I put in a 1/2 inch T connector and run it up the side of the bed with a 1/2 inch on-off valve. So if I finish growing vegetables in this bed for a period of time, I can turn that whole bed off, or over the winter, I can turn the whole bed off. I run the 1/2 inch up, and there is an elbow connector, and then I run the line across the top of the bed, and that's where I connect in the 1/4 inch tubing. Next slide, please. Now I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks, you don't want to run the 1/4 inch line from the ground up, because when your husband gets a string trimmer out, he can cut right through those 1/4 inch lines in no time. It goes right through like butter. So now I run my 1/4 inch line from the top of the bed instead of the bottom of the bed. So at the bottom, you've got the 1/2 inch supply line, and there's the little barbed connector. And then you'll see I have attached a 1/4-inch feed line, what I call a leader. This does not have inline drippers. It's just a plain 1/4-inch tube. And at the end of that, you'll see a 1/4-inch on-off valve. And as I said, I over-engineered this, but sometimes I like to turn off a whole row of irrigation if I've pulled the crop out. The carrots have come out, and now I'll turn that off until I'm ready to plant the next crop. And then into that 1/4-inch on-off valve is my 1/2-inch drip line with my emitters every 6 inches. Next slide, please. So then we get down to the critical question, and that is how much water do I need to put on this bed? And that's a matter of how long and how often do I turn on my irrigation timer. Well, first of all, you've got to check your soil every day to see whether it's drying out too fast or it's still wet, and whether you need to turn it on daily or not. You only turn on the irrigation when you need it. We don't want to waste water, especially this year with, it looks like we're going to have another drought. We want to put in only enough to water that top 12 inches of soil, the active root zone. We don't want to overwater and make the worms below really happy. In the summer, around here, that means we're going to probably water every day. I mean, starting in May, as soon as the rain stops, we're going to start using that irrigation timer every day. And I usually start at 5 minutes a day and check and see how it's doing. But in the height of the summer, when we're getting a lot of evaporation and we've got a lot of actively growing vegetables, we're going to need to replace about 1 inch of water per square foot every week. And to do that, we need to run that timer. If you've got your emitters every 6 inches apart, then you're going to run that timer between 8 and 9 minutes every night to replace the water that evaporates during the day. And that will put about 11 ounces of water on that square foot of garden. If you've got your emitters every 12 inches apart, then you have to run it twice as long. So that's 17 minutes a day. And that will take care of that. Next slide, please. And I think that is the last of my slides.
That was great. And
okay.
Thank you, Jennifer. And here's our QR code again. We're going to take questions in a second, but I wanted to give you a chance. It's such an easy way to get to this information. In addition, if you have your phone, here are some good resources for us, including the resource that'll direct you to everything that we've just talked about here today. So you can always visit us on our website or Facebook. Okay, now we're gonna take some questions, and let me stop sharing. Okay, and we'll pull up some questions. Yay, okay, so, this question looks like for Judith. George says, I have good success in growing sweet potatoes in containers. I trim the vines and I also eat the leaves. Very good in stir fry, just a thought. Sounds good. Okay, let's see. Kati asked a question. So Judith, this one is for you. You may want to unmute. And she says, can I replant the tiny tomatoes and only eat the larger ones?
You mean the potatoes?
Potatoes. Did I say tomatoes? Potatoes. See, we're all have tomatoes on the brain. Okay.
I would think so. You'd have to store them a while, and I'm not sure how you would do that.
And some people, I think, end up getting more than one crop of potatoes in. We had a master gardener here who has since left the area, but you know, I went to his house and said, what is that? He said, it's a potato. I said, it's not the right time of year for potatoes. He says, no, they just grow. So I would think, yes, you could. And okay, let's see. Okay, I think that's the same questions. Okay, here's another question, Judith. Kitty asks, in towers, does it matter whether the variety is determinate or indeterminate? Can you mix them up by level as far as the potatoes?
I don't know if that designation applies to potatoes.
I think it only applies to tomatoes.
Tomatoes, yeah.
But, and you know, Kitty, I'm going to answer part of that too. We did do a potato tower at Harvest for the Hungry at one point for Master Gardeners. And we layered them according to days to maturity. So we put the ones that have the greatest days to maturity on the bottom. And as soon as those came up, we covered them up. And then we put the next layer on. Or you can plant them all at the same time and just build your whole tower. And then you will be able to harvest the top ones first. So
can I just make a comment?
Absolutely.
It takes a while for potatoes to come up.
Mm-hmm.
I planted mine about 4 weeks ago, and I thought, why aren't they up? And I pawed around and I saw they're already growing leaves now, but it takes a while and it's hard not to water them, but you really have to restrain yourself.
That's right. That's right. Okay, let's see. Here's a question. We're going to give this one to you, Kathy. And this has to do with onions and garlic, and that wasn't our topic this time, but you know, we're coming up on sort of the crucial time. So George asks, how often should I water my onions and garlic? They're in raised beds. What would you say?
Well, I'm probably going to ask for help on this and other people's opinions. Basically, one of the reasons I love garlic is that I put it in the soil in October. If it doesn't rain at all, I give it a little water and then it just grows. And you know, you don't want the soil to dry out on the garlic until at the point though that the plant begins to, the leaves on the top begin to look a little drier and browner, then you want to hold back the water. Because at that point the tops are going to die back and you're going to let the garlic harden a bit, and then you can pull it up when the plants have kind of died back. The onions are similar. Onions are a little more persnickety as far as I'm concerned than garlic, but onions also take a pretty good continuous water, but you don't want them to rot.
Right.
So there's a balance. You really, again, as Jennifer was speaking about irrigation, it depends on the kind of soil you have. I have a sandy soil, so it's unlikely that they're going to rot. But you want to keep them moist, and then I find they're a little later producing in the season. I usually start with the onion starts, the small onion starts, which I've planted. I guess you could still plant them now, but I'm not sure. What do people think?
I think the bulbing onions should have been planted earlier.
Yeah, they take
We lived in Gilroy for 30 years, and the garlic capital of the world. Mm-hmm. And we have a lot of experience in onions and garlic. And usually with the onions, it's like Kathy said, it's the rotting part, you know, that you have to be really careful that you don't overwater them. So, but it's planting them at the right time for your area. And a lot of people have trouble with bolting also on the onions. But if they bolt, don't get rid of them. You can go through and dehydrate those, and you still have some great dehydrated onions. But the garlic does require quite a bit of, you know, continuous water, but I have mine in raised beds and I have not had the water on them. You can, like Jennifer said, stick your finger down in. It's been wet enough and I've mulched enough that, you know, they'll be okay. And it's curing the garlic. That's the important part too. You want it to be able to bulb up. And in May, we're going to have our garlic expert back, and she's going to talk to us about, okay, now what do you do as far as harvesting your garlic? So,
great.
Okay, let's see. I asked that already. Okay. And there's another gal that says that she sticks the tiny potatoes right back in the ground. And you know, if you miss one tiny potato, you will have potatoes forever. Okay, so Kitty says, actually, there really are two types of potatoes, determinate and indeterminate. Well, that's awesome. So we all learned something today. Okay, so let's see. You can also, I guess, plant potatoes in the fall and the early spring, so they get two crops at different times. I know that a lot of people leave their potatoes in and just dig out a few when they need them. What I found is I end up with fingerlings that are like this big, you know, and I don't know if I would do that. Okay.
Well, I'd like to just say that I wasn't going to fess up to this because it's not part of our Master Gardener protocol, but I always put in some potatoes in the fall. And even when they frost a little bit, I just mulch.
Yeah.
And I get very, very early potatoes. And so I do 2 crops of potatoes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So
yes, Ellie.
Jorge had a question for Kathy about fava beans. He was saying that he enjoys eating them. And I know that you can you leave some of them in the ground to eat instead of chopping them?
So you of course you can. The choice is, do you feed yourself or do you feed the soil? It's not quite so clear cut, but if you let the plants flower and produce the beans, those little lovely nitrogen, those pink nitrogen nodules that you saw, those send the nitrogen in the food back up to the beans in order to fruit. So you can still, after the plant has fruited or produced its beans, you can cut it off and you can add it to your compost, or you can use it as a mulch, but you're not going to get that nitrogen fixation in the soil in the same way. So that's a choice, but yeah, you can leave a few. Go ahead.
Yes, I've done that where I've planted real heavily and then eaten some, and it's really, there's very good.
You're not feeding the soil quite the same way.
You're not, no. Carol says, bodega red potatoes. Do you know where we can find seed potatoes for this local variety? Our farmer's market is now out of them for the season. Also, does anyone know where to look for bodega reds for eating? Bodega reds are on the Arc of Taste for slow food, and it is one of the 4 different fruits or vegetables that are important for this area. And slow food is trying to make sure that people become aware of that and buy them and eat them. But it is extremely hard this year. They had some issues. I tried to get some myself through the slow food, and they had some issues with because of COVID with their growers, and one of them went out of business, and there was a lot of issues. However, remember bodega reds for next year, and it would be slow food that you would contact. And there is a couple different chapters in the area. So, okay, so let's see. Ellie, does it look like I've missed any other questions?
No, I think you've answered them all.
Okay, that's great. You know what would be a great thing too is if you have questions for next month on tomatoes, if before you leave you put those questions in the Q&A or in the chat, that would be great, because we know everybody's super excited about tomatoes. And if you didn't start your tomatoes, don't worry, because Elaine, one of our speakers, is a master gardener, and she is on the board of directors at Harvest for the Hungry that has a huge plant sale, as does Petaluma Bounty and lots of the garden clubs. So she'll have a list of resources where you can buy some great tomato plants for this summer. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we hope we see you back next month.